Hey everyone, here we go once again. Yet another article, this time out of The Guardian, referring to two age demographics and completely leaving out and obscuring the fact that there's another age demographic in between these two. And this in regards to the millennials and the baby boomers. I'm sure you've already seen it personally yourself. And if you haven't, well, I've pointed out in multiple past videos, but every time the central planners, the so-called experts, the elitists, or those who want to socially and economically control and dictate and micromanage our lives, all they ever talk about are the baby boomers and the millennials. And just like I've said in the past, the very reason for that is if you think of the kind of people that go into positions of so-called authority, or these experts, or those in academia, or the political or pundit class, yeah, these are people that prolonged or put off having their children until much later in their life. So their children are actually millennials. Whereas there's a whole cohort of us, Gen Xers, that were predominantly consistent with historical norms as far as, having children and raising them. So it was done in our teens and our early 20s for the most part. So we have a whole segment of the society in Canada and all over the Western world that is completely overlooked and obscured as a fact, or as a direct result of the fact that these professionals, these boomers that waited till way later in their life, don't even seem to correlate or associate their own subjective experience or anecdotal experience with their counterparts in the boomer generation that had kids at younger ages in their teens and 20s, like I said, like people like my parents, right? We, Generation X, we are a small cohort in comparison to the millennials and the baby boomers, but we represent millions and millions of people in Canada, the UK, the US, all over the Western world. The fact that we're constantly overlooked and ignored, well, like I said, you just look to the people who are doing the kind of reporting, and that will help expand and elaborate on the kind of reality that I just tried to point out. Headline, like I say, this is out of The Guardian. Millennials are struggling. Is it the fault of the baby boomers? The post-war generation, now retiring in luxury, stands accused of a willful failure to safeguard young people's interests. The contributor for this article is Yvonne Roberts, Sunday, April 29th, 2018. The late 1940s were about bomb sites, rationing, loss and mourning, but amid the gloom, a new generation was emerging. In the grim, gray aftermath of war, children were born on an unprecedented scale in a population explosion, the baby boomers, born between 1946 and the mid-60s, had arrived. It was time for a new life. It was time for the young to grow up with faith in a better tomorrow. When we baby boomers reached adolescence, creating the teenager in the process, it was as if the floodlights had been switched on, revealing a colorful, contrary, anti-authoritarian Britain. In our teens, with rock and roll, if not much cash, we were the lucky, cocky generation. Anthropologist Helen Fisher inelegantly described the maturing of this huge post-war bulge in the population as like a pig moving through a python. Change in society as we grew older on a scale never known before. We challenged the Victorian puritanism, censorship, class snobbery, and inhibitions of the establishment. Full employment put money in the pockets of managers and factory workers alike. In spanking new houses with inside lavatories and proper bathrooms, higher purchase allowed him, and less so her, to spend, as if overnight everyone had become a toff. It could only get better. Yet today, baby boomer is a toxic phrase, shorthand for greed and selfishness, for denying the benefits we took for granted to subsequent generations, notably beleaguered millennials, who reached adulthood in the early years of this century. So where did it all go so very wrong? It may have been due partly to our irritating habit of hogging the cultural limelight, with constant references to the swinging 60s, serenaded by endless revivals of Lazarus-like pop groups who refuse to die. But there are a much more serious set of charges too. We were and are accused of sabotaging our children's future, hoarding power and money while expecting those with the least to foot the potential hefty bills as we march towards our 90s. So once again, like I say, you know, and in reality, the fact of the matter is yes, you millennials may very well at some point have to pony and foot the bill for all the boomers. But at this stage of the game, the ones that are actually genuinely out there footing the bill and providing all of the productive necessities and capacities out there, if you look out there on the landscape, you will recognize that it's the Gen Xers. It's those of us that are in our 30s and 40s that are out there carrying the load for everybody. You know, the millennials may very well enter in, you know, in large masses and large numbers into the workforce and become those who have to take on and assume that load. But at this junction, at this stage, no, it's Gen X, and we're having to carry the load of not just the boomers and their parents, you know, the greatest generation or the silent generation, but now even trying to help the millennials. So no, and it really pisses me off the fact that nobody wants to point out that it's us in Gen X, our demographic, our age group, that are now having to assume the task and responsibility of carrying the load for all of the other generations, for all the other demographics. Come on, for fuck's sakes, people. You can't forget about us. We exist. And in at least substantial enough numbers that if you don't start recognizing soon, like I say, Atlas will fucking shrug. I know myself, I'm pretty much to that point. I'm just waiting for everyone else to catch up and get on board. Because I'm already at that point where I'm fucking done carrying the load for everybody and being ignored while I'm doing so. At least if I was getting a little bit of acknowledgement for doing what I do, then it might be a little bit easier to carry that massive burden. Leading the flood of critics has been David Willits, author in 2010 of The Pinch, a book that sparked a flood of furious debate. Lord Willits, then a conservative minister, is now chair of the Resolution Foundation think tank. The charge, he declared, is that the boomers have been guilty of a monumental failure to protect the interests of future generations. Next week, one jury will deliver its verdict. The Resolution Foundation's Intergenerational Commission publishes the groundbreaking 2-year investigation into millennial Britain on May 8th. The Commission rightly says that intergenerational fairness is a major issue, but so too are the troubling inequalities within the generations. Intergenerational war doesn't reflect how people feel about the issues or how they live their lives as families, said Torsten Bell, director of the foundation. Yeah, intergenerational war on so many levels, socially and economically. The boomers, yeah, they wanted all their freedoms. Remember that? You know, free love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But now, holy Christ, that group, while they've gotten older, they become much more conservative. And now look at what they're doing. They're trying to restrict not just our social activities to a certain degree, but even our economic activities, and completely micromanage and regulate them to the point where everything we do is controlled by this cohort that has had power for seemingly now, well, decades, but it just, for especially for people like myself, you know, I'm 47, it seems like it's literally just gone on forever. Since I was an adult, it's been this way for 30 plus years. Well, I started work when I was 15 until now, it feels like it's just that one cohort, that one generation, the baby boomer cohort, that just gets to control, micromanage, and dictate every aspect of our lives. And yeah, just like your fucking authoritarian mommy or daddy, when they get fucking pissed off or they want to target you or they want to treat you like shit, they'll do so. And it's not just a matter of now, like, you know, back in the day when I was a kid, when it was a belt, a wood spoon, a stick, a switch, or their hand, or smack you at the side of the fucking head, or their foot in your ass. Now they got the power of the state at their disposal. So now their authoritarianism has stepped up, you know, a few notches to the point where, like I say, it's like us Gen Xers, we were never actually allowed to grow up. And that's why when I look out there, I see a lot of people that are full-grown adults, but they act like children. Their mentality, their psychology is still like a child, like an adolescent. And no wonder, because they've never actually been given the chance to have real, genuine freedoms. Their lives are still, our lives are still, like I say, so completely micromanaged and manipulated. It's like we've never had the chance to be free. And we may very well at some point, we may very well go through our whole lives never knowing what it means to have the kind of freedoms that the boomers had and enjoyed. The Commission signals that it is time to remodel the welfare state, which was crafted at a time when a pension was only expected to last a handful of years before death took its toll. Young people are deeply anxious about housing, jobs, and pensions, while those who are older are concerned about health, social care, and the fragility of the welfare state, and the future of their own children. Well, some of them anyways, right? Everybody wants to fix this, says Bell. If we want to keep our promises to the different generations and maintain the welfare state, we have to think radically about how we do this. Then it shows a little chart here. Millennials spend almost a quarter of their net income on housing. Cohorts of the silent generation in their 20s spent under 10%. Although I would say, like I say, well, here in Canada, the statistics would be much higher. And I can't imagine that this statistic is actually legitimate if it's only a quarter of their net income. Because as we're seeing today, well, I guess when you average things out, that's the problem with just doing averages, right? Because in Canada, and I'm sure in the UK, a lot of the people are actually, especially the younger people, are paying out much more in excess of just a quarter of their salaries to pay for a roof over their head. And guess who's benefiting? Guess who's selling those houses, at these speculative, ridiculous valuations that are profiting tremendously and profiting from millennials and Gen Xers, as I'll point out. Yep, once again, we exist. It's the boomers, because they bought their houses on the dirt cheap, right? And now they're getting to sell them at these, like I say, at like 10, 20, maybe fucking 25 times what they might have originally paid for them. They're selling these prices at such ridiculous valuations and levels that they're making off like bandits that they can retire just from selling their house. It's like it turned into a pot of gold. Whereas, like I say, Gen Xers and millennials, well, we're the ones, once again, just another example where we're the ones being screwed over and on the hook and paying for all this shit. The Commission has already revealed a profound cross-generational pessimism about the prospects of the young. The escalator that for decades ensured that younger generations had a better standard of living than their parents has stalled, and that has ramifications for life. Britain, along with Greece, is now the most pessimistic among the advanced economic countries, a mood that has potentially catastrophic implications for a country's well-being and resilience. When an entire cohort is not succeeding, everyone understandably feels a real need to fight tooth and nail to keep what they've got. The rich are much better suited to win that war, Bell warns. That's a real challenge for social mobility and a disaster for politics. Pessimism is not new. In the 1970s and 80s, inflation reached 21%. 3 million people were on the dole. Poverty was soaring, and Thatcherism had laid waste to manufacturing and industry. On a full grant and from a working class background, I was one of the 8% who went to university, charged up with notions of women's liberation, revolution, and an envy of Mary Quaint's unaffordable wardrobe. My best friend had left school at 16 and moved up the managerial ladder, earning what our mothers called a good wage. Pessimism was the national trait, but we all had hope. I was 28 and single when I put a deposit on a tiny flat. My parents were in their late 40s before they took out a hefty mortgage on a modest bungalow. That escalator in action. Life, money, and opportunities had an elasticity that they lack today. A minority of millennials are rich, but the majority are definitely not. While almost 2 million older pensioners, mainly female, the silent generation, live in deep poverty. The Resolution Foundation has provided forensic detail on how this has come about and why. A complex mix of reasons include the financial crisis, austerity, and reluctance by successive governments, albeit ones filled with baby boomers, to radically tackle the challenges of housing, healthcare, social care, employment, and a woefully deregulated market at a time when people are living so much longer. But no baby boomer banditry. Politicians have failed to decide equitably in this different climate who pays and how and what they receive in return. Anyways, now we're getting to the point where, once again, where it's just someone that's putting forth and presented their own personal political ideology at this point in this article, because I guess they're trying to suggest, or she's trying to suggest, that you just need government. Government can fix things. Well, government's not the fucking right answer, folks. It never has been, and it never will be. And I hope these boomers, well, they'll probably never learn. You can't, what's that old saying? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Apparently, these old dogs don't want to learn any new tricks. So, you know what? Forget about them. You know, listen to the stuff they espouse, because at least in this article, you're seeing some admission of guilt. So, looking towards government and that forced income redistribution, or using the big gigantic gun in the room to correct some past habits or behavior. Once again, that's all these fuckers know. That's all they have ever known, is using force and violence as a means to an end. Well, let me tell you, folks, that's a terrible fucking way to do anything, because, well, yeah, then you end up, that's the problem, of course, is, yeah, then you end up with successive generations that think and perceive that that's the only way, that's the only methodology that could be used. And I've heard people argue that in the past and on a continual and ongoing basis. To me, it's like, I'm trying to help you out here, folks, because no, you know, there's other alternative methods. And trust me, just like in my own personal family and raising my children, just like in a small community or in any province or country, yes, you don't have to use preemptive force, violence, or threats thereof, or this whole pretense of what if and collective punishment as a means to an end. That's actually, like I say, that's the kind of conservatism, that's kind of old school, old world way of thinking that I want to reject completely. And I can't believe that most of the boomers that are out there today are seemingly willing to allow this shit to happen, when they know, when they were younger, they knew how hard it was and how much they had to fight and rail against their authoritarian parents. Why they don't want to reciprocate and acknowledge the fact that maybe they are a representation of that same kind of authoritarian mindset that their parents had. The fact that they're unwilling to acknowledge and recognize that and maybe pass the torch, and not just down to the millennials, for fuck's sakes. Like I say, stop forgetting about us Gen Xers that exist and now, like I say, are carrying the greatest burden and the heaviest portion of the load. Because if there's one thing, another realism, another truth statement is, all you people like you boomers, you need to recognize this now, okay? You're all getting old, getting long in the teeth. And just like when you came into this earth, being completely dependent and relying on others, well, as you start to get to the end of your life, that happens once again, where you once again become reliant completely on those around you and your successive generations. So, if you've treated them like shit, well, the reciprocal effect, the reciprocal aspect of that relationship, well, it'll rear its ugly head, and it'll be rough times for you in that later stage, in that last stage of your life. I hope a lot of you out there are starting to recognize and realize that, and starting to correct some of your habits and behaviors, and hopefully, if you do so, and you do it in enough time, where it doesn't look like you're just scrambling last minute, well, maybe some of your offspring, maybe your successive generations will start to come around and care about you. Even though, like I said, you've forsaken them for decades. They might still give you the chance, the benefit of the doubt, if you at least try to correct course and become actually genuinely moral in your stance and your habits and behavior. It's a Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.